have been talking about the paper Introduction to Philosophy, and we had been discussing about the concept of epistemology, specifically in the unit 4 about social contract, about justice and knowledge. We continue discussing this theme further. This paper is introduced to the first semester students for the University of Delhi under the UGCF and EP syllabi. And this is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Today, let us discuss about the interconnection between knowledge and ethics from the Western perspective and the Indian tradition. Now, Western modernity, here science often it is treated as value neutral. Ethics is applied externally. In Indian traditions, knowledge is tied to liberation and ethical transformation. The comparative insight, if we see about knowledge and ethics of the both, is this, that in Western, separation of fact and value is there. In Indian, integration of knowledge and ethics is there. The enrichment is that the scientific temper becomes ethically responsible, sensitive to consequences. Universality versus contextuality. In the Western approach, we have the universal laws, objective truths independent of context. In the Indian approach, we have context-sensitive reasoning, emphasis on situated knowledge. And the comparative insight is, of course, that in Western, it is all universalism. In Indian, it is contextualism. Thus, the scientific temper balances universal validity and local relevance. Again, when we talk about D.P. Chattopadhyay's mediating vision between the East and the West, or the Occidental and the Oriental, we see that Chattopadhyay proves a bridge, a scientific temper which must be rational, historically grounded and culturally embedded. He resists blind imitation of Western science and romantic glorification of tradition. Instead, he advocates a critical synthesis. And he says that philosophical synthesis ought to be a richer, a scientific temper that emerges only when we club from the Western philosophy empirical rigor, logical precision, experimental method, along with from the Indian traditions of epistemic pluralism, reflexivity, ethical integration and dialogical reasoning. So, Western philosophy teaches us how to know with precision, and Indian philosophy teaches us how to know with awareness. Together, they transform scientific temper into a holistic practice of reason. The democratization and enrichment of scientific temper in societies like India depend on these syntheses, which is not rejecting Western science or not uncritically glorifying tradition, but creating a dialogue of rationalities. A truly global scientific temper must be empirical yet reflective, universal yet contextual, critical yet ethical. Now, if someone is to question whether or can Indian philosophical traditions enrich scientific temper, we understand that by now Indian and Western traditions differ fundamentally in their approach to reason. Western philosophy is shaped by thinkers like Bacon and René Descartes, emphasizing on method, empirical observation, experimentation and logical precision. In contrast, Indian traditions, as interpreted by Chattopadhyay, stresses on contextual and plural rationality, integrating perception, inference and testimony while remaining sensitive to cultural and historical conditions. However, these differences are not oppositional but complementary. Western philosophy contributes rigor clarity and systematic inquiry, while Indian traditions offer epistemic pluralism, reflexivity, dialogical reasoning, and ethical integration. Together, they expand the scope of rational inquiry beyond neural empiricism towards a more inclusive understanding of knowledge. Thus, a synthesis of both tradition leads to a holistic scientific temper, one that is empirically grounded yet self-reflective, logically precise yet ethically aware, and universal in aspiration yet sensitive to context. Western philosophy, represented by Francis Bacon and René Descartes, emphasizes on method, on empiricism, on experimentation, on logical rigor, and Indian traditions, as highlighted by Chattopadhyay, stresses on contextual and plural rationality, integrating perception, inference, and testimony. Thus, these approaches are complementary. Western thought provides precision and scientific method, whereas Indian philosophy contributes reflexivity, ethical depth, and dialogical reasoning. Their synthesis results in a holistic scientific temper that is empirically grounded, culturally sensitive, and ethically responsible. So we see that the East and the West do not just diverge because for their work, but there is also a context and a theory which we must understand. It is again not the case that everything has originated from the East, nor is it the case that everything from the West ought to be shunned. There can only be a way out when we club both the Indian scientific temperament and the Western scientific temperament. We must also understand that when we talk about the aim of knowledge, for example, in Indian tradition, it has largely been on moksha or understanding, be it the Astika schools where we have the Charvaka, the Jainism and the Buddhism, or the Nastika schools. And just a footnote, Astika and Nastika schools are nothing to do with those who believe in the authority of the in God, but rather those who either believes in the authority of the Vedas are called as Astika schools, and those who do not believe in the authority of the Vedas are addressed as the Nastika schools. Now, be it the Astika schools or the Nastika schools, except Charvak of the Nastika school, they all diverge, be it Jainism, be it Buddhism, they all talk about moksha, they all talk about nibbana, they all talk about nirvana. So when we talk about the aim of knowledge, we see the ultimate goal is just not to be knowledgeable or to have knowledge about the world, but to have knowledge about the self along with the world is equally important, for the ultimate destination is moksha or nibbana or nirvana. And in the Western philosophy, we see that this concept of liberation or moksha has been bracketed or rather negated entirely. In the West, again, there is no such connection between the explanation. There is just about explanation, prediction, and control, and that's about it. In the Western philosophy, there is very little or barely anything that talks about self-realization or that is more important about the inner world. However, when you look at the entire series of Greek philosophy, starting from Thales onwards. Now, Thales has been the father of philosophy, followed by Anaximander, Anaximenes, and so on and so forth. So, even in the early Greek philosophers under the Western philosophy component, we see that their search or their explanation or their pursuit has largely been about the cosmos. Now, what is the cosmos? The cosmos is the cosmological structure or the world. They were not really bothered much about the inner world. And so they are, the early Greek philosophers from the Western philosophy are thus rightly called as the materialists or the mechanists, or as of that matter the empiricists, or as of that matter the ones who could be called as the raw scientists. Their question upon which a lot of early Greek philosophers had hovered around was, how did this world come into existence? What is the reason for this world to be? And the father of philosophy, Thales, had said that it has to be water. For example, from the Panchabhuta of our Indian side, we see that at least the three elements naturally has also been picked up by the Western, the early Greek philosophers, and they saw the aim of knowledge to be entirely towards knowing the outside world. Thales had talked about it as water. Anaximander said that, well, something which is huge, something which is supreme, something from which the entire world comes into existence cannot be limited in concentrated natural elements, and thus what was previously known as arche, which is the Greek word as Thales had come up with, Anaximander mentions about this as apeiron, and he says that the aim of knowledge for the Western is the apeiron, which is indeterminate matter. What is indeterminate matter? Indeterminate matter is that which cannot be controlled or which cannot be clubbed to one substance of the natural elements. Now, when we see the entire line of the Western philosophers vis-a-vis the Greek, there is Anaximenes following Anaximander. Now, Thales, please understand, Thales had talked about water, Anaximander talks about indeterminate substance, Anaximenes says that it has to be air. So someone has picked up water, someone has picked up something which is infinite or apeiron, and air as arche for Anaximenes. Following, we see Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is interesting, for he said that there has to be a logos along with the arche. Yes, rightly, he did pick up fire as the arche. What is arche? Arche is that ultimate substance from which everything emanates from, how the world comes from, and Heraclitus says it is arche. But along with arche, there has to be the logic, and his logic or his logos has been the theory of becoming. Now, what is becoming? Becoming is something which is temporary, which is not there, which is in between being and not being. So, we see the gradual journey of the early Greek philosophers from Thales, from Anaximander to Anaximenes to Heraclitus and beyond, picking up at least a substratum of the natural elements to as the aim of knowledge. Till here, there has been no such introduction of liberation or the concept of moksha or the concept of understanding. As mentioned, they were only interested about the knowledge of the outside world. Gradually, when we go beyond the earliest Greek philosophers to the middle Greek philosophers like Parmenides, who talks about the notion of being, and Zeno, who tries to follow his master or his teacher and says that, let me disprove the antithesis. So if Parmenides talks about being, in his very famous quote, being, only being is, not being is not and cannot be thought of, Zeno absolutely seconds to what his predecessor Parmenides had said and says that, well, if being is the only reality, that means not being. What is not being? The empirical world does not exist. And he tries to disprove the empirical world with the help of two elements, which is motion and plurality. Zeno says that the entire sustenance that depends are fundamentally dependent on the pillars of motion and the pillar of plurality. However, Zeno, vis-a-vis his various maxims like the bow and arrow, the stadium and others, he shows that this two foundation is contradictory. For he says that the concept of plurality itself has all the contradiction involved, just like the concept of motion has the notion of contradictory involved. How is motion contradictory? He says that motion, after all, is nothing but a culmination of rest points. How is it a culmination of rest points? He further says that, for example, if I shoot an arrow out from the bow into the air, there is a time t1 that the arrow travels to tz or t infinity till it reaches the target. Say the target is tz. The distance travelled by the arrow t1 to t2 to t3 and so on and so forth are nothing but rest points. This argument is also often applauded as the argument from infinite regression or infinite regress, where he is taking the argument backward. So he says that when the very core principle of sustenance for the aim of knowledge is itself contradictory, how can motion be the foundational ground of the empirical world? Thus, he criticizes those philosophers who had said that this world is the real world. Till the Middle Greek philosophy, again, there hasn't been much of a shift, unlike until with Parmenides and Zeno to a certain extent, where they did go beyond the empirical world. They did talk about the notion of being, which cannot be a part of this empirical world. We do see a shift from the empirical world to the transcendental world. So the aim of knowledge in the Western philosophy, which they had bracketed liberation or the concept of moksha or the concept of self, slowly started shifting towards the notion of being or towards the notion of the non-becoming world. Now, after this comes the sophists, the Protagoras. Of course, there is Pythagoras and others who had come before them, but let's concentrate on the most important part here, and that is the sophists. The sophists are basically some of the harbingers of the sophist school, like Protagoras. He had said that man is the measure of all things, of all that is, it is, of all that is not, it is not. Basically, meaning that man is at the center stage for decision making, which is subjective, which doesn't really have a JTB or a justified true belief, which basically means that if I'm saying that the sun is rising in the east, rising from the east today, and tomorrow I say that the sun rises from the west, I will be okay, for they were in a way the harbingers of absolute relativism. Now, this again has problems, and as a student of philosophy, we understand that the sophist school was not very well taken. For the other part which was problematic in relation to ethics of the sophist is to charge a high amount of fees for them to impart knowledge. And knowledge was supposed to be free, and that brings us the picture of Socrates. Socrates, who was anti-sophists, comes up with his magnum opus, the book called The Republic. Now, please note, the book that Socrates, followed by Plato and Aristotle, it is said that Socrates had not written anything as such. It is his disciple Plato who had documented. So it is basically Plato's work, but then the protagonist has been Socrates. It said that this work, Republic, was initially written in the language Greek, but naturally Plato was a Greek man. But the book that we specifically, the one that has been prescribed in our University of Delhi, is the Desmond Lee's translation work of the Republic. And this work is considered to be the closest translation of the Greek word, for the theme does match. And out of the language English that this work Republic was translated to, it was also translated to the language Latin, and in Latin this work Republic is called as Politia. So there is this version of republic. There is also the version of, in Latin it was called as res publica, and in Greek it was called as politia. So be it politia in Greek, res publica in Latin, or the republic in English, the theme resorts or revolves around the aspect of governance. So in this book, Plato discusses how the aim of knowledge should not just be about bare minimum and taking help or taking clue from his master Socrates. We see the influence where Socrates thus mentions that an unexamined life is not worth living. Here, the minute Socrates says an unexamined life is not worth living, we see that the relation to ethics come into the forefront. For just if we go about in our everydayness without really examining our life, we are not really progressing. So as much as we need to progress to the outside world to know about the whereabouts, we have to also examine our inner thoughts. The further question then is, how do we examine our inner world? He says, know thyself. Now what is this know thyself? Know thyself is know yourself, and this marks the shift. As I have said, yes, they may not have explicitly talked about liberation. Yes, there is no such concept of moksha as such. But when they talk about knowing thyself, there is a huge demarcation where about knowing the external world, they are from the time of Socrates slowly going back to knowing themselves. And this makes a slight inclusion of knowing about the inner world besides the external world in Socrates' philosophy, and the similar thread of thought is also seen in Plato's Republic, where Plato talks about the various notions. Specifically, he talks about the theory of forms. In his theory of forms, he talks about the allegory of the cave, besides of course the divided line simile, the simile of the sun. And in this allegory of the cave, he shows that the aim of knowledge is not the dark knowledge or the knowledge that we are born into or the knowledge that we assume to be true. And to exemplify this, he gives us the allegory of the cave, where he says that all of us are born into a prison, or rather a cave, which is filled with darkness. The only difference being, at the threshold of the cave lies a fire that is perennially burning. Now, the outside world shows on the wall the shadows of all the objects that lays outside the cave. So all the prisoners who have never seen the outside world and they have always been born with their faces towards the wall, they have always considered shadows as the real piece of knowledge or as the real object. Now, as Plato elaborates, one of those prisoners frees himself and he goes out of the cave. Please understand, cave is all about darkness. His comfort zone was darkness. He goes out. When he goes out, he is startled. He is amazed by the brightness of the outside world, and his retina, his pupil, is not being able to adjust. So he casts his glance to the comfort zone, which was the shadow of a tree. When he sees that the shadow of a tree has an owner and the ownership is owned by the object tree itself, he realizes that all his life that he had thought to be the real world was only an illusion. Furthermore, he then thinks that how is the owner, the tree here, the particular object tree here, is dazzling in such brightness, and very slowly, very steadily, he tries to look at the main source, and that is the sun. And that moment was the eureka moment, the defining moment for this now freed prisoner, that I need to enlighten my fellow beings or the fellow prisoners about the real aim of knowledge. The real aim of knowledge is not just to have knowledge about what we see or what we think, but it goes beyond. He comes back to the cave full of enthusiastic energy, and he tells his colleagues, his tribe, that whatever we are seeing so far is only an illusion. The real world lies outside. As expected, his revelation is taken with a pinch of salt. People are not comfortable with what they are seeing, and they laugh at his revelation. This shows that whenever we try to deviate from the given evidential proofs, we will not be taken easily. We will have to argue, we will have to debate, and this part was important to bring to your attention that yes, as much as we say that Western philosophy is all about explanation and prediction and control, and the relation to ethics is often separated, but with Socrates and of course Plato, there have been an integration. There have been some synopsis, there have been some whisper, there have been some vision where we do see that they do connect with the inner world also. So again, to quickly recap what we have done so far about the Indian tradition, mostly the nature of reasoning has been mostly contextual and pluralistic. With the Western philosophy, it has been universal and formal. With epistemology, Indian tradition have had multiple Pramanavadas, and we have talked about the Nyayavad, the Madhyamika, the Buddhist tradition, and so on and so forth. In Western philosophy, it basically, thanks to Francis Bacon and René Descartes, it is basically empiricism and rationalism, and of course John Locke, let us not forget John Locke. The methodology or the method in Indian tradition, again as mentioned, has been dialogical and dialectical. In the Western philosophy, it has been typically analytical and experimental. And in relation to ethics, Indian tradition has been integrated, but in Western philosophy, it is often separated. And the last but not the least important point about the aim of knowledge. Indian traditions, it's all about liberation and moksha and understanding. However, in Western knowledge, as much as it is to do with explanation or prediction or control, with the emergence of our post-sophist school in Greek philosophy from the Western module, we do see Socrates, we do see Plato, who talks about knowing thyself, who talks about allegory of the cave, who talks about the theory of forms. So this is only to bring to your notice that there are of course certain exceptions. Maybe they have not been explicated in detail about the concept of liberation or the theory of form as something to do with liberation. But what Plato was clear that this theory of form or this transcendental world cannot be a part of this empirical world. If it is a part of the empirical world, it would be an imperfect ideal. For the ideal of perfection entails that it is anadi, it is eternal. That is, it is beyond space and time. And anything and everything which has a space and a time is bound by birth and death. So be it institutions, be it civilizations like Harappan and Mohenjo-daro civilization, all come with a time specification and of course extinguishes with a limited time. But if we are to talk about a perfect world, if we are to talk about a theory of form, it has to be aspatial, atemporal. Thus, the aim of knowledge, as much as it has been about the outside world largely for the Western philosophers, they also, some of the exceptions as have been mentioned, also talks about the inner world, about the self, about the knowledge of the self, and so on and so forth. To conclude, scientific temperament emerges differently. In the West, it is a methodological rigor, and in India, it is a philosophical and ethical rationality. However, nor can we say that everything is best about the West, nor is everything in India to be rejected. We need to find a common ground between the West and the East to make the scientific temper all the more rigorous and all the more valid. Thank you so much.